originary scene without having to theorize it. It's that central object. You just have to have that one big idea, you know, that hedgehog idea, that the central object is sacred, and the rest, in a way, and the rest sort of derives from that. And the notion of justice involves a reflection on that, which would be posterior to it.
Peter.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask about the question of modernity, and I also wanted to let everyone know that the conference next year is going to be in Salt Lake City and Provo, and the tentative conference theme will be the question of modernity, which encompasses modernism, postmodernism, postmillennialism, performatism, and obviously it's a huge topic. And so I just kind of wanted to get us starting to think about that topic, and I was wondering if you had, if any of you had any thoughts on what generative anthropology, what's distinctive about the generative anthropology understanding of modernity.
Yeah, all three of our plenary speakers talk in one way or another about modernity and its problems, so I'm sure all of you would have something to say.
I'll let you guys answer this one.
I have to leave very soon. In fact, I'll probably leave a little late. It's a very interesting question because, all right, modernity. Again, there are medieval sources cited by Le Père Chenoux, who's a very great medieval archivist, historian, commentator, where you have 11th, 12th century abbots complaining about this modern thought, this modus, you know. This, you know, modus, I guess, pensando, I don't remember the Latin anymore. So modernity is now. Modo just means here. And so we have this thing called postmodernity, which is, in a certain sense, helps you to periodize things. In a certain sense, it makes no sense. There's even something called post-postmodernity. I don't think there's much future in trying to decide what is modernity. You have early, you know, the French historians are wonderful. They talk about early modernity, you know, early modern Europe and all these kinds of things. Periodization is arbitrary. We need it to block out a curriculum in those things. But my answer, Peter, is that there's no epistemological future in that kind of research. The difference, let's say, between medieval Europe and Renaissance Europe, that difference is, as the French say, is éclaté. It's all over the place, you know. The historians don't want to paint themselves in a corner, and they nuance, and pretty soon there's paint all over the room. So I abandon that as a category for thinking or a topic of research. And on that down note, I have to leave you. I'm sorry, I have to catch a plane. Okay, my friend, we'll be in touch. All right. Aussitôt que possible. Great to meet you. We'll be in touch too. Thank you.
We lost a third of our panel, but we still have a little bit of time. Mark, did you have some thoughts on that?
I'm hanging on for the distinction of thirdness by the end of this afternoon.
Adam actually talks about third.
Oh, yeah. Well, then he got there before I did. Well, how about this? That modernity would begin again every time somebody stopped to reflect anthropologically on the originary scene. It begins to appear from the kinds of analysis that we're hearing that, you know, that sense of a threshold past, indeed of an originary threshold that will appear again and again. It's, you know, there are certain moments and places in our culture where we can see that consciousness focused, and we might just find it, you know, tactically useful to think of each such moment as the enunciation of a version of modernity. Modernity being defined now as a style of response to, reflection on that originary moment. If you want to worry about the use of the Latin word modernus, I can tell you that it first appears in the lexicon in the 6th century of the Common Era, as people just past you know, the terminal phase of the Roman Empire in the West begin to register a difference between themselves and their predecessors, both classical and Christian. It's not a strictly post-classical moment. It's as much a recognition that there have already been several generations of Christian founders by the 6th century. So the moderni are a classification already in view in the 6th century. It wouldn't be difficult, I think, to find suitable exponents of a kind of proto-generative anthropology in that period if one looked. That is, if Augustine had failed one at a slightly earlier period. I wonder if I could ask Eric to go back to the trajectories that he was mapping out yesterday in talking about the way postmodernism defined itself by an exclusive emphasis on the second of the two constitutive problems that appear in the era of the big man and thereafter, which was the problem of ethics versus morality. In the same connection, but more briefly, he mentioned another threshold moment that I think we all recognize, that problematizing of aesthetic resolution that was conventionally dated to the Romantics, but against which, I've always assumed, European modernism in art and literature tries to provide some kind of a restorative bulwark. I mean, part of the difficulty of the language of postmodernism is, depending on whether you're speaking French or English, you may or may not have modernism as well as modernity in view. I'm just curious to know what the alignment is between the modernist attempt to transcend the romantic problem of the failure of aesthetic resolution, that early to mid-century, 20th century phenomenon, which is underway but then itself aborted, truncated by the catastrophe of mid-century, which in the kind of synchronies that we've been working with that you have suggested announce the onset of this postmodernist phase of Victor Murray thinking. Does modernism, in the quite specific sense of, in literature, T.S. Eliot and co., have a distinct role in the disclosure of this postmodern era?
In originary thinking, well, first of all, Andrew left before I could say anything to disagree with him. Andrew has this kind of all or nothing attitude sometimes, but I think periodization is always kind of ugly. And I think that the sort of phenomenological notion of modernity is really very helpful. It perhaps would give you a good point of departure, even to talking about any historical manifestations. In other words, is what you could call the modern experience. But in any case, to answer your question, in originary thinking, I created a kind of chronology of periods. Knowing that there's always, there's always something a little bit naive about talking about any kind of periodization, because in any period you have people doing different things, and what is the Romantic era means that you're talking about certain works, you could be talking about others, and these modes are not necessarily, they're determined by various things and so on. But I do think it's necessary. I think not just because it helps you to form your curriculum, but because it's a way of explaining the formal differences in works, and that's why I found the aesthetic the most useful way of talking about periods, because you have aesthetic forms which are at least relatively accessible, because you can find it in this novel. You can see the difference between Flaubert and Balzac because you can see it in this limited amount of experiential material, in other words, in this document, if you like, as opposed to talking about periods in the political sense. Of course, in France, it's useful because you have all these regimes, but that doesn't tell you the zeitgeist, if you like, whereas you're talking about, and the notion of the zeitgeist is one of these sort of Dilthayan ideas, but what I was interested in is the realities of social organization, which are ultimately, if you like, the kind of experimental material that we have to understand how humans can get along, in other words, coming back to ethics. And so they're all, society is a series of ethical experiments, And